So we had a great start this morning, and now we continue with our second panel that looks at some of the policy implementations and really kind of thinking about some of the ideas we talked about this morning in practice. So our first speaker is Emily Brown, who's a faculty member at Syracuse University College of Law.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here. My talk is a little bit different than I think a lot of the other ones you're going to hear today or what I'm presenting on. I have a background as a political consultant, a litigator before coming to the College of Law last year. And as a lot of the talks mentioned, these things, these ideas, many of them require buy-in from the public, the electorate, our elected officials. And so my project that I worked on this year with some undergraduates and some law students was an attempt in a sort of a very specific situation to get the public to engage and to help us as professionals, as lawyers, as communicators, as economists, as others, to be able to sum up these complex topics in a way that people can understand them, because they're not going to be buy-in for subjects that people don't understand. So title of my talk is Climate Comments. The full title was Climate Comments, Leaders of Tomorrow Impacting Climate Change Today. And I got a grant last year from the campus as a laboratory for sustainability, basically to fund small level funding to try to engage the campus community, undergraduates and graduate students, and also different projects on campus to become, as a campus to be more sustainable. So what I proposed, what was the genesis of the project was to have a very complex, how do we take fairly complex issues and simplify them so that the general public can understand. And the genesis of my project was the net neutrality decision of 2014. It's since changed. We have had some changes in the policy since then. But if you think back, in 2014, at that point in history, from 2005 to 2014, telecommunications companies had spent millions of dollars lobbying with regard to net neutrality, over $66 million. By May of 2013, it appeared that these efforts would pay off and net neutrality would be defeated when Tom Wheeler, a former lobbyist for the telecommunications industry, was selected as chairman of the FCC. So net neutrality is a fairly complex issue, not as complex as some environmental or other regulations, but something that the average voter and the average citizen does not necessarily understand. So suddenly, at this time in 2013, there was a great shift in debate surrounding net neutrality and the rulemaking process. What happened? The proposed FCC's rules impact was summarized, described in accessible terms, and conveyed to a large number of people. Those people were provided a link to the government website where they could make their voices heard. This happened, if any of you watched late night TV, with John Oliver. I used this as a template for basically crowdsourcing or attempting to crowdsource input. Now, in what context would this be? Well, the federal rulemaking process has, for properly promulgated rules, the public can engage. And so what we tried to do was using graduate law students summarizing some of the proposed changes, and then undergraduates to help translate it to even simpler terms, and then try to get undergraduate populations, 18 to 24-year-olds, to engage in this public policy debate. So, to summarize what happened with the FCC, on June 21st, 2014, late-night cable host John Oliver spent 13 minutes on the show explaining the potential ramifications of destroying net neutrality. Oliver provided a direct link to the directly to the FCC. The next day, the FCC received 45,000 comments. The website crashed. In that time period, they received 45,000 comments. So it is an unusual process in the FCC. It's a five-person panel. There was a one swing vote. Mr. Wheeler was it. He changed his mind and had said publicly, and many people have said publicly, it was this crowdsourcing of input from John Oliver's program that at the time made help this change possible. So I've taken that idea and translated it to how would you do this in the climate change area. And this year we focused on one rule, the proposed repeal of the Clean Power Plan. And we set up a website. We had 3 law students, both throughout the first semester, were tracking sort of what the new administration was doing with regard to rollbacks. We decided to focus on one issue, one major regulation, because it was sort of the most easy for the general public to understand. And then we worked with undergraduates who designed a website where you could, and a social media campaign. So if you go to the Climate Comments website, it's scrollable, and there's different tabs you can look to where when you can comment, how you follow the Climate Comments, either Facebook page or Twitter account. I learned what an avatar was. I had never, avatar is a little picture that you use for Twitter. These were not things I knew prior to this. It's a different generation. And basically, engaging these students to help communicate issues of climate change to their peers. And so what did we do? Well, we worked with a team. There was last semester we had 4 undergraduates, majors at Newhouse, and then we had 3 law students. And all 3 of the law students are also dual degree students, 2 with ESF and 1 with Whitman. And they helped design, so it's kind of a interdisciplinary project, design this website to be accurate scientific information, palatable at least to some of it to the business community and others that is translatable in that context, and then our undergraduates using basically running a PR campaign for us. So we had our avatar for our Twitter account. They designed some graphics with regard to, we focused mostly on the United States, climate change here and how it impact here in the US using last summer's scientific report and also other data maps where you could click on and look how your state was going to do. And the undergraduates named it the Climate Change Comments for the Average Human, because even when we translated them as law students, the undergraduates still found it too complex. And these are college-educated, or seniors in college at Syracuse University, and Newhouse is a great school. And so if they can't understand what we're trying to communicate, there's no way the general public would. So what we did was take the proposed rules and summarize them. And here you go. With every link, you can directly link to, what is the Clean Power Plan, and a direct link to commenting on it. Within each area, we had basically summarized, what are these guidelines, what do they mean, what is the background of the Clean Power Plan, and really written at a level that is in that 8th to 10th grade reading level, so the average person can understand this and can feel as though they can get information, engage in this, and then go and comment. We also gave tips on our Facebook page, our Twitter account, and our main account about how to comment. This was actually the original deadline. The deadline's changed a couple of times. It was originally going to be in December, moved back to January. The final deadline where they increased the chance for participation is actually tomorrow. We also gave a couple examples of comments that you could make, both for and against the repeal. We obviously didn't want inaccurate information with regard to the impact on the climate, but some of the issues with regard to federalism and with regard to industry, we tried to reflect what may be some of the interest, accurately reflect some of the interests that would be against it, and then obviously many of the concerns with regard to support of the Clean Power Plan. We also talked about the endangerment finding and the previous litigation with regard to climate change in the United States. And one of the things that we did was also build off of resources that were already out there. So for each state, the previous administration, EPA, had put up single-page flyers with regard to how your individual state would be impacted. This is if you look at some of the research with regard to communications and climate change, people don't want to see polar bears. I mean, there's a news story about how there was actually a news story about this recently about polar bears. People don't want to see little kids holding signs. They want to know personal stories about how people were potentially impacted by climate change or increased weather events, and also how their state's going to be impacted. So in a way that is easily accessible, these were two-page flyers that we provided links to about how individual states would be impacted, likely be impacted by climate change. And then also we provided the executive summary and the documentation with regard to the scientific report that was released last summer. We also provided links to and summaries for the every CSR report, the different congressional reports, the think tank reports with regard to what Congress members were getting about the Clean Power Plan. So we had the many iterations of those reports that have come out in a couple of years, easy access to them. And some of the different information about easily accessible, easily readable information about distribution of CO2 and the sources of CO2, mostly in graphics and other forms, so that the average voter, the average citizen, the average college student could consume this information relatively quickly, basically decreasing the engagement cost for people who want to know more about this and want to be engaged in the public process, the political process. some at also the national, international, and national level. So this is sort of we expanded. It was supposed to only be sort of the first semester this year, but because they extended the deadline and had additional listening sessions, we've been updated the Facebook page and Twitter account with ongoing listening sessions and different news stories that have been coming out about climate change and the impacts of climate change throughout the last 6 to 9 months. The final deadline for commenting is tomorrow. So it's been moved a couple times. The deadline is tomorrow at midnight or 11:59. So far, there's been about 90,000 comments in this area. We have, we hope to get a lot of engagement. One of the barriers that we saw was that, especially with all the different political issues arising now, it's really hard to gain traction in the public sphere. And so what we tried to do was make these, summarize everything in an accessible way, advertise the best we could. We tried a couple of things with boosting and getting people involved. We didn't get quite as much engagement as we would have liked, but I think it was a great sort of learning curve for our law students and our undergraduates, figuring out how to communicate with each other and work in the sphere where they're really getting the skills moving forward when they're the dual degree students who are ESF and law, the dual degree student who's at Whitman and law, the undergraduate in communications. How do you present these complex topics to a broader community? How do you work with the experts, whether it be law, economics, engineering, science, and then how do you work with bridging that to using your expertise in writing and communications with the general public or whoever your client may be? So the countdown period, we have 1 day left. This was before the morning talk this morning. And this was sort of the main focus of it throughout this year. We're hoping to build on this, but this was we focus on the Clean Power Plan repeal this year.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. For those of you who require, we're about to put up the warnings. The next speaker is David Driesen, who's a faculty member at the College of Law as well. I'll put up your slide.
Okay, I'm also concerned with the economic dynamics of progress on climate disruption, and I've been concerned for some time about the potential tension between short-term efficiency and incentives for innovation. And so I'm going to talk about that briefly and explain what I'm seeing out there, and then I'm going to mostly focus on potential research questions that come out of recognizing that tension. I think this is very congruent with other people have said so far about a need for a mix of tools and a snowball effect. And the first thing to say is that it's pretty widely recognized that this is not an incremental problem, that we're going to need wholesale transformation to deal with climate disruption. This is sort of the scientific consensus combined with the global goal of avoiding dangerous climate disruption. And the reason for that rests on a fundamental, uncontested scientific fact, which is the cumulative nature of greenhouse gas emissions. They live in the atmosphere for an extremely long time. And what that means is every year in which there are any emissions, it's getting warmer. So you could magically cut emissions by 90% next year, and it would be warmer because there'd be a 10% left over to be added year after year after year. And so it's a very serious problem, and because of that, with the models that try to figure out what would be needed to avoid dangerous climate disruption are talking about close to zero emissions by the year 2100. And actually, I meant to update that slide, really 80% now globally. It's worse than that looks. 80% globally by 2050. And while there's uncertainty about the magnitude and timing of climate disruption, and hence about these numbers, there's pretty widespread agreement that this order of magnitude of cuts is what's needed. So we're not talking about incremental change. Ultimately, we have to make a fundamental transformation about how we use energy and phase out other greenhouse gases as well. But the primary tools that have been the focus of debate, and are at least the rhetorical center of most countries' climate policy are environmental benefit trading, sometimes called emissions trading or cap and trade, and carbon taxes. Now, environmental trading, what you do is you set a limit on sources of greenhouse gases, but then you say if you offer some comparable benefit, you either sequester carbon or reduce emissions of some greenhouse gas, you can avoid your own local obligation and purchase credits representing this other activity instead. So that's an optimizing kind of reform, because what it does is it lowers the cost of greenhouse gas reductions, because people make these transactions when they can identify lower cost opportunities. And that is the policy that has been most followed around the world. But in Europe and in British Columbia, that we also have some carbon taxes. And carbon taxes are, the idea that you put a price, you force people to pay taxes on every ton of carbon dioxide emitted. And that also causes a least cost allocation, because what happens is people with expensive abatement options just pay the tax. But if you have cheap abatement options that cost less than the tax, you're likely to do something to reduce emissions to avoid the taxes. So they're both very efficient and sort of ferret out the least cost ways of reducing carbon. Now the problem, though, is that the ways that really have dramatic effects on greenhouse gas emissions and have technical potential to get us towards zero tend to be expensive. Nuclear power is a prime example of that. Another would be solar energy. And if you look around at where we've seen a lot of technological change, fundamental technologies in recent years, there isn't much evidence that emissions trading or taxes are driving force. And so, for example, the solar prices have come down dramatically to the point that they're competitive in recent years. And while not certain, it seems to be that it's the feed-in tariff in Europe that may be driving that. And what a feed-in tariff does is it says to people, if you produce renewable energy, we're going to pay you a fixed price that's above the market price. And so what people do then is they ramp up production to get the money, and then they try to figure out how to do it more cheaply to enhance their profit margin. And so it's been pretty successful. And then another one is CAFE standards. The reason that hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles exist is because of fairly old-fashioned emissions standards from California that have been copied by the federal government and other countries that have made it worthwhile to do this. I'm kind of curious, I haven't done any research yet on the biofuels mandates, and somebody mentioned in the last panel, some of the biofuels are counterproductive, but there are also calls for more advanced biofuels that won't be counterproductive in some of these things. It'd be interesting to study. One research question is, has that pushed any innovation? So the question is, what would it mean to create a law in economics of decarbonization? To figure out the economic dynamics of decarbonization. And some of the questions one might look at is optimizing existing infrastructure a waste of money in the long term. That is, for example, coal-fired power plants, we can get cheap reductions by improving heat rates. Is that simply a waste of money because we need to shut down coal-fired power plants in the long run? Does investing in interim technologies impede going to zero? So the reason that greenhouse gases have reduced, they've actually come down in the US in recent years. The main reason for that is hydrofracking. It's made natural gas so cheap that people are shutting down coal or switching from coal to natural gas, and we're getting a lot lower emissions. But the question that I think is worth thinking about is investing in a lot of natural gas, is that going to make it harder to get where we really need to go to zero emissions? Because natural gas is not a zero emissions technology. More broadly, can short-term efficiency lead to long-term inefficiency? Another more particular question that comes out of a particular piece of research I've done has to do with the waterbed effect. I've recently come to the view that taxes are far superior than trading, because I do think we need a mix of mechanisms. And the problem with trading in a mix is that if you have a trading program in place and then you add on some other policy, like say an information program to encourage energy efficiency, That will lower utility emissions, that will generate credits, and those credits will be bought by somebody else and let them increase. So the net effect is that in the presence of a trading program, new policies don't produce extra reductions as they would with the tax. And that's beginning to be realized, and it's retarding development of supplementary policy. So Europe has backed away, actually, in recent years from binding European Union energy efficiency and renewables targets because of this. Can you design around this? Because we have a lot of trading programs in place. Can we do tweaks on the design of the trading programs so that they don't discourage or render ineffective supplemental policies? What policy tools best catalyze innovation? Another question, why do some countries seem more cost sensitive than others? Part of this efficiency thinking is, we need low cost policies because if it costs cheap, if it's cheap, people will do it. Countries will do it. But in fact, we're seeing something totally different. No matter how cheap the policies are, places like the United States will not adopt it on the federal level because they seem to have an attitude that any cost would be devastating to the economy. And then in places like Germany, we're perfectly willing to pay extremely high electricity prices to subsidize renewable energy, and they view it as a competitive disadvantage. So it'd be interesting to look at that. Another thing I'm working on, populist political economy paper that could be a fertile field for research. Most of the political economy is looking, one of the advantages of something like a trading program is that it facilitates compromises among special interests and among market-oriented and government-oriented legislators. But that seems to be an antiquated model in the United States. Mm-hmm. We have become so ideologically divided that the idea of getting climate policy out of the federal legislature is, in my opinion, not very much worth thinking about. The question is how to use climate policy to change electoral results. So you want exciting policy proposals that people really care about, which means they can't be purely environmental, because the polling shows that environmental issues are not high on people's level of priority. So I've thought about, what about a carbon tax to fund infrastructure, which polls extremely well and is an important, perhaps exciting policy in the United States today because of its job-generating potential and because our infrastructure is crumbling. So, I think we could use more research in populist climate policy where the goal of the policy is to change electoral results. Another question, does climate policy give countries a competitiveness advantage? That's one of the motivations in Germany, but it seems that a lot of the solar technology is relocated to China, so does that work? Something that's interesting. Another question, what about trade sanctions against the US? In the Montreal, in the ozone treaty regime, we had the idea that if you don't comply with international goals, you can't sell ozone-depleting chemicals. Now, should we have something similar in the trade area? Is it feasible? Can it be justified under the existing law? How can you structure these in a way where they don't do too much economic damage and where they're effective against a big, powerful country like the US? So there are a lot of questions to think about in trying to create a favorable economic dynamic. I do think there's a tension between always pursuing short-term cost effectiveness, and there's a lot to be done in thinking through what has to be a pretty thoroughgoing transformation over time.
Thanks so much, David.
Sure.
So our next speaker, I'm pleased to introduce, is Dalindyebo Shabalala from University of Dayton School of Law. Thank you. No PowerPoint, right?
No PowerPoint. So I get to have a really good handoff because this is the question, right? The issue of transformation. How big is it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the fundamental tension that reflects the problem for climate at the global level in terms of technology, right? Which really is this question. How do we get technologies into developing countries who are rapidly industrializing at the scale we need to and in the time that we need to do so, right? Can we rely on our current market mechanisms to do that? Or do we really need to think about a fundamental transformation of the nature of international technology markets in order to achieve that, right? And so there are a couple of premises I want to provide in order to get to that answer. So the first one is to point to the historical structure of international environmental agreements in technology, especially for global commons problems, right? Ozone is sort of our prototypical example, but we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, we have the other Rio Conventions on desertification, right? All of them reflect this fundamental structure, which is there's a global common problem, right? A commons problem, a pollution problem. Developed countries realize that this is a problem. Note that they've sort of gotten out the other end of this, and then you develop an international environmental treaty to try to address this commons problem. But in doing so, in order to get developing countries on board to give up that exact same technological pathway. So in the Convention on Biological Diversity, it was to get countries with high biodiversity from using that biodiversity, harvesting it, destroying it in the same way that developed countries have done so. To get them to avoid doing that, you need to provide them with an incentive to participate in the environmental treaty. And the two mechanisms are always, we'll provide adjustment costs and the technological tools in order to choose a different path to do that. So the Montreal Protocol with CFCs and HFCs is a classic example, very technology specific, which means there are limited lessons from it, but nevertheless, a classic example of the international environmental framework of how that worked, right? We have to avoid chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere. We have developing countries who are rushing headlong into sort of the appliance market for these products, developing them. You have a growing middle class in many of these countries. You want to come in and say to the manufacturers and to the consumers in those countries, you can't have these kinds of refrigerators and coolants. You have to have something else. But in order to get them to agree, you have to provide them with the finance and the technological options to do so, right? And so in the Montreal Protocol, in particular, you had the fund, the multilateral fund, which was built around this idea that you have funds to finance the deployment of these technologies into these other countries. But fundamentally, what the Montreal Protocol realized was also, you don't get the benefit of this if you don't change what the manufacturers in those countries also do. And if you're going to change what the manufacturers in those countries do, they also need to be able to produce non-CFC products, refrigerators, coolants, etc., which means the technology has to be in their hands, which means either they have to license it from the current technology holders if it was proprietary, or they at least need to buy know-how in order to do so, right? All that takes a huge amount of cost, huge amount of money, and somebody has to bear that cost, right? And in the Montreal structure, in the multilateral fund, it was developed countries that provided a significant chunk of the support. So many of us think of the Montreal Protocol and the multilateral fund as a success. We addressed the problem. We did get that transformation. But one of the things that we can point to is the experience of India and South Korea, particularly in that situation, right? And we've had lots of people do studies like this, is that, for example, South Korea, the cost of licensing was prohibitive. The advantage that they'd historically had of essentially low-cost production was essentially going to be negated by the cost of licensing these new technologies. And so they sought help from the Multilateral Fund to develop their own domestic alternatives, right? Money for doing adaptive research and development, money for doing commercialization. And the Multilateral Fund had rules in place that said they would not do that. They would not provide funding for that kind of domestic replacement technology. And so, of course, absent that, the Koreans then took a slightly longer path, but did go ahead and develop their own technology, bore the cost themselves for that. India, in order to get India on board, a specific promise had to be made to provide that kind of funding in the multilateral fund, and India was somewhat more successful in ensuring that they were able to get enough funding for doing that transformation. That's one technology, right? And it took years, and it was hugely politically difficult, right? And so the argument that people like myself are making about the climate situation is that it's fundamentally more complex, as Josh said, right? It's a really wicked problem, right? And it's wicked in a couple of ways. So it's wicked in a timing problem, right? So when we think about the 80% reduction by 2050 globally, one of the things we have to realize is that means peaking, right? Peaking emissions by, so 2020, which is just 2 years away, or 2025 in most developing countries, particularly China that we're talking about, right? And so that peaking date means that you've got 2 to 7 years to distribute all the current relevant technologies across this diverse range of sectors, right? All the silver bullets that were pointed out by Ed, right? That diverse range of technologies into those countries, just current technologies. And then to ensure also when new technologies are developed, that they get into those countries at a minimum sometimes in the 2030s, but hopefully definitely by 2050, right? How are you going to do that in this context? 2 to 7 years, getting current technologies, both proprietary and non-proprietary, into those markets. So one of the ways so that's one of the problems, timing, right? How are you going to be able to do that under current mechanisms, under current markets, under current rates of diffusion? And all the models show business as usual doesn't get you there, right? Any business as usual model doesn't get you there. So how do you shift from the BAU model into one where you have really strong technology diffusion? And then an aside, because I'm a bit of a geek about this, one of the things I find really frustrating about the IPCC models on this is that they have relatively static models of technology diffusion as part of their climate models, and so it's really frustrating to sort of look at what they're doing and try to figure out if there's a way to get a dynamic model of diffusion into their analyses about where they think technology is going to go. But I think we're going to get there. Right? So aside, the scope, right? The scope of the problem is huge. So as I pointed out, it's not just that you have to have all these silver bullets, right? So, I had a nice long chapter in my PhD that just spent lots and lots of boring time talking about each and every technology, when we think they would need to be diffused by, right? And so the areas that we can talk about, right, in particular that I think are interesting and that people don't normally think of when they talk about climate, for example. Appliances, right? So this means this thing, refrigerators, televisions, right? All these electronics that we have an energy efficiency problem, an energy use problem, and we have, of course, heat pumps, right? A whole bunch of these small appliances have heat pumps, and all these have technological solutions, many of which are proprietary because many of them are software-based solutions, energy management solutions, right? Appliances is an area that is huge as a function of growing emissions that are going to come up, energy use that's coming up, but people don't talk about, right? Transport, right? One of the areas that we talk about is electric cars will save us. Of course, right, one of the issues is, yes, but only if everybody in India and China gets to drive one of those, right? If they all get to drive fossil fuel cars, then they will play no part in helping us address the problem, right? And those, of course, also have a significant chunk where they are proprietary. Right? And so, right, batteries, right? Right now, we don't have the batteries that we need to store energy. As soon as we solve that problem, it's going to be great. But then right, the problems and solutions are likely to be proprietary. And if they're proprietary, right, we've got to think about, okay, what are the means by which we're going to get those proprietary technologies into all these markets that we really need them to get into, right, across the international borders. So my expertise, I hope, is in describing and in discussing what the experience has been of addressing these two major issues in the international negotiations, right? So I've been working at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change now 10 years, and I was a youngish man when I got in there. I'm a little older than I was when I got there, maybe older than I should be at this point. But one of the patterns in the Climate Change Convention is exactly this, right? It is just the Montreal Protocol problem, the environmental agreement problem writ large. How are you going to get developing countries to shift from the known development path, which is primarily fossil fuel consumption, to a non-fossil fuel consumption development path? right? How are you going to do that? So that's a technical problem. It's never been done before. So we have to figure out how those countries are going to do that development in a way that we have no model for before, right? How do they do a non-fossil fuel development path? And in that context, if they're going to do that, at what cost? Are they going to be expected to pay the full cost of that themselves, right? Or are we going to provide support for them to do so, financial and technological support? And the UNFCCC, under the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities Program, set up the idea that there would be support. And I can tell you that that support has not been forthcoming, right? Either financially at sufficient levels, and definitely not technologically. And so the pattern that we've seen is, at every one of the big meeting outcomes, Paris, Cancun, Marrakesh, the initial negotiations have huge texts on technology. There are about 10, 15, 20 pages on technology support, technology implementation. By the time you get to the final document, you have a page or half a page of an article that talks about developing discussions and getting there to agree on some mechanisms for technology support. Right? And so the most recent one out of the Paris Agreement, we have one article, Article 10.4, that promises the development of a technology framework to address the issues of innovation, enabling environments, implementation, stakeholders and collaboration, and capacity building and support. These are the basis for discussion. This is not the framework itself. They have not agreed on this framework. Right? And so the likely outcome is going to be the same, which is some mechanism for discussion, but not necessarily outcomes. What we do have, right, are several areas. The Climate Technology Center Network, which is essentially self-funding or has to raise voluntary funds, and which is meant to provide pilots and models for deployment of technologies as pilots in developing countries. But all that funding is entirely voluntary. Countries simply provide it. It's not part of any financing mechanism. The Technology Executive Committee, which is supposedly a policy setting mechanism that's meant to provide ideas and advice, but essentially it is the place where the ideas and the debates go to die. Having spent significant amounts of time in that committee myself, I have participated in the killing of ideas in that committee, but it essentially is where a lot of the stuff that is controversial goes to die and is meant to stay there. The Green Climate Fund, right, which is really the primary mechanism that might be most comparable to a multilateral fund, has the funding mechanism and does have a technology stream, but they are not yet sure how to implement that. And the concern there is, what are they going to implement and what are they going to do? And it's going to be primarily deployment, diffusion. They're not, at least as it stands now, going to provide the kind of financing that will enable firms in those countries to engage in the kind of innovation and adaptation necessary to commercialize those to their domestic market, right? That's off the table at the moment. And so the question really is, other than the funds to buy products, what else are they going to do? Are they going to provide money for people to buy licenses if they are proprietary technologies? If not, then how are they going to support the kind of transfer of proprietary technologies in that context? And of course, the financing is not enough. The GCF has nowhere near the amount of financing that is meant to come to that to get those into those countries. And in particular, right, it is depending on this idea that they're going to get private sector market money into these countries in ways that has never been the case before. Somehow there will be some sort of magical sort of role that the public finance will play in generating private finance into these markets that already have difficulty getting private finance into those markets in the first place. So at least my assessment, and again, I think it is both a little idiosyncratic but not necessarily off the table, is that the UNFCCC is ill-equipped, right, to address both the timing and the scope of the problem, in part because the negotiations and discussions have misdiagnosed to a significant extent the nature of the problem. They've made the commitment, but they've misdiagnosed, or at least how they're going to address the issue. And so to sort of throw a little bit out to the room, right? One of the things that I think the UNFCCC can do, right, is to really think about what role it can play in addressing transactions. And so one of the things we know about, even in proprietary technologies, right, is that you have to think about going from a niche market to a mass market, right? How do you go from niche transactions, right, where you negotiate every single transaction, you find a partner, you go through that whole process, to one where you're talking about mass transactions, right, where you are simply getting the technology out there to everybody who's willing to pay for it, right? And so one of the things that you can think about is that the UNFCCC can play a role in aggregation, supply aggregation, right? Getting all the suppliers of the technologies and of licenses into a platform that is provided by UNFCCC, and demand aggregation, right? Getting all the demanders into the same market, right? Really creating a mechanism in the UNFCCC that's kind of a platform for exchanging and transactions, and then using the financing power to essentially get everybody who participates in that platform to go to a mass transaction model rather than a niche transaction model. So right now, the one platform we have is the one at WIPO, right? WIPO Green, which is very much a niche transaction model rather than a mass transaction model, right? And you can imagine taking that from that one niche individual transaction model to a mass transaction model, right? And then that they can use the financing as a lever for that. And of course, that can be a market signaling device as well, right? That this is where you go if you want access to the market for the transactions and where you want the financing to market your products into these developing countries. I think that'd be one of the really good, strong ways for the UNFCCC to get where it needs to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll have some time for questions, but our last speaker is, please introduce Keith Maskus, Department of Economics, University of Colorado Boulder.
All right, well, I think I'll just stand here, and thank you for the invitation. Very interesting conversation today. So the instructions about what to prepare weren't entirely clear, and I'm an international economist, really, so I thought what I would do is focus on a couple of important international dimensions. I'm really glad to hear your last intervention, though, because I was thinking about talking about some of these technology transfer issues, but that got into an hour-long conversation, yes, which I don't want to do. So, but if in the comment period, maybe we can get a little further. So, I'm not an environmental specialist. I'm really rather an international economist with a focus on technology transfer and intellectual property issues. So I'm not going to talk about those things. Instead, I'm going to try to spend the time I've got available to address what recent economic evidence and thinking have said about two really essential policy issues, one of which we've spent a lot of time on this morning, and one which we spent almost no time on. So one is, how effective have carbon pricing and carbon tax programs around the world been at cutting emissions? We talk about them all the time, but there are some out there. And what makes a program effective? Countries, second, may choose, and I think often choose, the United States is the best example out there, to have limited or no programs in that area because they're worried about the international competitiveness implications of having higher costs for what are referred to as environmentally intensive or energy intensive, but trade exposed sectors. And these competitiveness problems act as a real blockage to try to put together some kind of national program, at least, if not even subnational programs. Well, it's no surprise that the subnational programs are in areas that are not really net exporters of these kinds of commodities. Carbon pricing. So this has already been discussed. Just say a few things here. The clear need for effective internalization of the total costs of emissions. Never clearer than it is today. Some climate change scientists argue that the whole world average temperature rises to 2 degrees centigrade by 2100 requires zero net emissions by 2050. That's what I've seen. You saw 80%, but however you want to think about it, it's enormous. and technically probably not possible. I can tell you that the economists working in climate change models that I'm aware of, and I know most of them pretty well, when they try to model the economic requirements to get to that technical outcome, they just throw up their hands and say that there's just no way, that cannot happen. The path dependence that the developing world is already on in terms of using fossil fuels can't be changed that quickly. But nevertheless, those same economists will tell you that in their models, really the only significantly important or significantly effective way to get there is through very high carbon pricing, through carbon taxes, through cap and trade programs that may allow some ability to approach achieving that goal. Here's why. Carbon taxes should significantly economize on fossil fuels, shift use and technology towards renewables, generate R&D incentives for alternative energy models, provide tax revenues that could be effectively deployed to incentivize technology diffusion and adaptation mitigation programs. Let me just say in passing at this point, with respect to technology diffusion internationally, it's a hugely important problem. If we don't figure out a way, I don't think 2 to 7 years is in any sense likely, but if we don't figure out better mechanisms for not just making these technologies available, but actually providing incentives to adapt them to local conditions, the ability of the developing emerging economies to actually participate in this goal will be much diminished. And to put that in very practical terms, we have lots of sort of new agricultural technologies that are reasonably environmentally sensitive. They're almost never diffused into developing countries, and one reason for that, one big reason for that, that often gets sort of swept under the rug is that the local climate conditions, the local soil conditions are different, the marketing conditions are different, and the need to actually invest in adaptation of those conditions is there. It's very real, it's very costly, and there is no mechanism for it. None whatsoever. And last point on this slide, we may actually be at a tipping point. I'm sure you've all heard. I think it's legitimate. There's considerable interest in actually seeing more carbon pricing put out by the corporate sector. It isn't just the energy companies, but all kinds of companies have said, please give us a carbon tax. We need it. And partly that's public relations, but partly it's because these companies see where the future is, if they're optimistic, or is not, if they're pessimistic. And so from their standpoint, actually finding a way of tying their hands in a cost basis is actually a beneficial thing. So even though we've talked about a carbon tax, at least as we've seen it so far, not being terribly effective, I would argue that a very swinging carbon tax is about the only thing you can do to get to where we need to go. Now, we've got some significant experience with international programs to raise carbon prices, whether through cap and trade programs or formal carbon taxes. I think we can draw a few lessons from them, and there are certainly better experts in this audience than I, but let me just try to go through a few comments here. One, countries seem to prefer carbon markets, cap and trade programs, to carbon taxes. So the majority of the major programs in Europe, the newly formed or newly announced one in China, which is big in that it covers their energy sector. That's basically 7 state-owned enterprises, including the big electricity generation state-owned enterprise. It still covers only 30–40% of carbon emissions in China. But nevertheless, as it emerges, maybe it will make a large difference. But those are all cap and trade programs. And to me, this preference is remarkable given the apparent policy advantages of carbon taxes. You get revenues, it's harder to evade, harder to game, taxes can be phased in over time, they're transparent, and so on. Whereas with cap and trade programs, what has happened more often than not is that there's an initial program announced, some rights are put out there, some quotas are established, and then over time those quotas are increased rather than decreased to try to push the carbon price up. It's a political economy solution, or political economy outcome that makes it difficult to actually sustain carbon pricing that generates a very high carbon price. So In Europe, there was certainly some large change in those prices for a while, but that's essentially disappeared. And the initial prices announced in China are just not very large, I think, in this context. So I think I already commented on China enough. Carbon taxes. What about carbon taxes? As of 2015, these had been enacted in 16 countries. Some have disappeared. 2 Canadian provinces and 1 city, my own, Boulder, Colorado. There's one place in the country, actually in the world, that has its own carbon tax. I wish I could tell you what effects it's having. I mean, we see a little entry on our energy bills, basically, and then there's something in the gasoline tax, but it's relatively easily evaded. The median carbon tax across these programs is about $18 per metric ton of carbon dioxide. And that's been applied to about a median of about 45% of emissions in those taxed areas. But with a very large variation from almost nothing being taxed to a large part of the economy being taxed. Mostly aimed at fuel purchases and or electricity generation. Those have typically translated into fairly modest increases in natural gas and gasoline prices, somewhat higher in coal prices because of the higher carbon content in coal. But it's hard to compare outcomes across these taxes, but I think a few lessons are worth pointing out. One, the tax in British Columbia, which has been mentioned a few times this morning, aimed at fossil fuels. So British Columbia's experience may not be very translatable anywhere else because their tax is aimed at fossil fuels, not electricity generation, because their electricity is generated almost entirely by hydropower. So here's an example of a province, mostly a city, Vancouver, where there are a lot of progressive politicians and people who vote in progressive ways, and they don't have to worry too much about raising costs for their electricity generation sector through this tax. So they've actually raised it from its initial level of $10 per ton to $30 per ton, which is where it is. And that's cut emissions by, from what I've seen in the literature, about 10 to 15%, and significantly reduced emissions intensity. Not much impact on state output or employment, but you would expect that in an open economy where you're just talking about a province. Not a lot of effect there. The tax is, as I said, somewhat progressive, and when you take account of what they've done with the revenues, it's now popular, actually, and seen as successful. On the other hand, Australia's carbon tax lasted just 2 years until a conservative government came in and repealed it over competitiveness concerns. That may sound familiar sitting in this country. Covered fuels used in electricity, it covered fuels used in electricity and seemed to generate a fairly large drop, about 12% in CO2 emissions, but those have come back up to pretty much where they were. And there have long been carbon taxes of various kinds in Nordic countries. These seem to have been reasonably effective at reducing driving and gasoline use, but less effective at cutting industrial emissions intensity. The reason seemed to be that there are extensive exceptions in place, and those exceptions come about because, like other countries, those Nordic countries are worried about competitiveness. Okay. So a few points to ponder about research questions. Carbon taxes, in principle, are the most effective policy available, but they're often supplanted by carbon markets, which are less effective for, I would say, structural reasons associated with who actually gets to design the policies. Taxes often come with exceptions for competitiveness and local industry comparative advantages that limit their full effects. And even the most effective taxes don't generate enough emissions cuts. I will agree with what has been said a number of times here this morning, that carbon taxes, as important as they are, aren't enough. They just aren't enough, at least not at any politically feasible level. So all of this raises interesting research questions, most of them about the political economy of taxation. Why this preference for cap and trade? We could speculate about that, but it is quite interesting. I think needs to be sussed out more. How should carbon tax revenues be allocated to increase emissions reductions, and how to buy off these exposed sectors? Which leads me to the second issue, border carbon adjustments, border taxes, if you want. Just in passing, I can tell you that I spent 12 months from October 2016 to October of last year as the chief economist of the State Department. And one of the things I did was try to explain border tax adjustments to the White House. They didn't understand them then, they don't understand them now, but nevertheless, These are similar but not the same. So one reason carbon taxes and prices that come out of cap and trade programs are not as high as you might think they should be, and are also subject to extensive exemptions, is of course concerns over leakages. And there are really two kinds of leakages that at least economists talk about. One is through fossil fuel prices. If we increase prices for using these taxes, so consumption prices and gasoline, using these products go up for gasoline or for heating or whatever go up, what that means is that reduces fossil fuel demands in places that regulate their economies in this way, but that just shifts the supply of available global fossil fuels to the developing world, or at least to those countries that don't regulate, in which case prices go down there. And the net impact on global demand is negative because there's a tax, but nowhere near as large as you might think, just based on the tax itself. So it tends to drive down local prices, and that raises use and emissions. And the second form of leakage that we talk about is just this competitiveness one that I mentioned. If taxes are high enough to diminish production of these goods in regulating countries, then output could very well shift to non-regulating countries, whether that's through foreign direct investment moving or just increasing production in those countries as a matter of comparative advantage. So all of this means that countries might be willing to be more aggressive on domestic or regional carbon pricing if they could avoid these leakage effects. Right? So the standard idea to do that is border carbon adjustments, which means something adjusted on both imports and exports. An import charge on emissions embodied in goods and services imported from non-regulated countries to equalize the effective tax treatment with domestic regulations in the regulating countries. And an export rebate to firms that have paid local taxes but export their goods and services to non-regulating countries. The argument there being those prices are higher. To establish a level playing field, you need to rebate those prices back down as they go to these other countries. So this would be what we would call a destination-based carbon pricing mechanism that would internalize these social costs, at least in the regulating economies, and also level the international playing field. All right, so there are sound economic reasons for why you might want to think about such a program. But what does evidence tell us about how effective they would be? Well, before I talk a little bit about that, let me just be clear on something. There are no such border carbon adjustments, so there's no evidence in the context that we usually think of it. What do economists do? Well, the same thing that scientists do when they're talking about the future. They put together general equilibrium models and try to figure out what the counterfactual results would be from various kinds of policies. So using a series of CGE models, about a dozen simulations of this kind of find the following. Leakages are potentially significant. If you think of the Annex I countries raising carbon prices enough to cut their CO2 emissions by 20%, which would, in effect, cut global emissions by 10% directly, there would be about a 12% leakage rate, meaning 12% of that cut would emerge in higher emissions in other countries. That's an average estimate with very high variability to it. Some of these models generate as much as an 80% leakage rate, but that's the average. So even at that level, that's pretty high, right? There's a lot of this that's going to happen. These border adjustments then could be put in place. That would be a form of the policy complementarity here, and they can be effective at offsetting these leakages. It cuts the average leakage rate from 12% to 8%. And 4% of this kind of scale is actually pretty substantial. So these sort of exposed sectors in the regulated countries, in the end, wouldn't suffer much. They would be generating lower emissions intensities, but not cutting their domestic output very much. But there are at least two major problems with this kind of approach. First, these border adjustments in these models, but I'm not surprised by this outcome, the way these models work, they generate very significant terms of trade losses for the non-coalition countries, the ones against which these border adjustments are levied. Right? So they pay a large burden, the same way that developing countries who are exposed without WTO rules to unilateral tariffs by the rich countries or larger countries would be exposed with strategic tariff setting. So that might in the end, induce more cooperation with those countries. If they sort of see that this is the way the game is being played, maybe they say, okay, we'll put in our own carbon pricing system. But I think it's just as likely, maybe more likely, to expect retaliation. And the impact on overall global emissions cuts turns out to be small compared to the global carbon price result, which is the efficient solution, where you set a global carbon price or a global carbon tax. So if you think about it, the efficient solution is this generally harmonized, coordinated pricing policy. In this context, what you get is some emissions reduction, some leakage, and non-abating countries end up, in fact, with higher emissions as a result of these policies. And we can add some additional concerns about these border adjustments. Comprehensive systems seem fairly unrealistic because all the legal problems attached to them. Export rebates may be considered illegal subsidies under WTO rules. That's a very good research question as to whether that's true or not. I've written myself on whether R&D subsidies are sanctionable under WTO rules, and in some circumstances I think they would be. I think these almost surely would be. So you can imagine not doing that, and in fact, maybe the rich countries would say, okay, we won't do the export rebates because we're not really net exporters of these commodities to speak of anyway. Although I doubt that. Also, the WTO has always discouraged import charges based on source production techniques. So how is this really any different? If you permitted this sort of thing happening, why not do this with respect to labor rights, with respect to other kinds of competition issues that you could think about? And how should the tariff revenues that get collected be deployed? Perhaps used to compensate domestic exporters? Well, that's the rebate problem. Perhaps used to compensate foreign firms that are facing these charges. Or maybe put into green funds. There are lots of ways you could think about the efficient resource use. But my guess is that's not likely to be the outcome. But I think if you were to get some coordinated solution on border adjustments, perhaps putting these things into actually funding the green fund would be an outcome to be preferred. So here are a few additional research questions. What is the scope for modifying WTO rules on border adjustments for managing global public goods? How can this happen in a way that precludes or discourages the abating countries from using these policies as strategic trade instruments? These things would generate a fair amount of revenue. Are there efficient and equitable means of using these revenues to encourage carbon reductions in developing and emerging countries? Or could they perhaps be usefully deployed to incentivize technology transfer and adaptation in the ways that we were talking a little bit about? So I'll stop there. Thanks.
We're running a little bit behind, but we started a little late, so we had about 10 minutes for discussion or questions. Are there, first of all, any questions? Yeah. Zach?
I have a question, particularly for David and Dalindyebo. So you both said something that resonates with each other. David, you said that the rhetorical center of the debate here is carbon taxes, or in any case, something like emission reductions, kind of in the short to medium run. And Dalindyebo, you said that in the SCC discussions, particularly the Paris Accord, there was a lot of discussion about how individual countries can commit to their individual reductions, but very little on technology. So, and actually discussed this in my paper, like you could imagine that each country submitted two plans, one for emission reductions and one for here's how much we're going to contribute to funding technology to reduce emissions, which will benefit the entire world, just like investments in New York, or the rest of the country, investments in Germany, the rest of the world. So I'm curious for both of your thoughts on why don't we see more of this? Why don't we see more emphasis in rhetoric and policy accords on the clean tech technology?
You're asking why we don't see more success in technology transfer, or?
Why don't we see more discussion? Why don't we see it more implemented? Why don't we see more discussion of it? And why don't we see more implementation of it? Not technology transfer, technology development.
Well, yeah, the reason I say it's the rhetorical center is that if you actually look where the emission reductions are coming from, they're not from the carbon pricing as a rule. because the caps, it's mostly trading programs, and the caps have been too lax. And even California, which has a pretty good cap, if you look at the projections, about 80% of their, I think the numbers are a large majority are not coming from the trading program, they're coming from other programs. It's a great question about opinion about this. There is some evidence that when you use a pricing policy, the public tends to resist it more. And some of the resistance depends on how you say you're going to use the revenue. It turns out there's more public acceptance, believe it or not, for spending the revenue on renewable energy than on paying a dividend or paying down debt, even though paying down a debt is a more economically efficient thing and more palatable to conservatives. So there's some tension there. I think the reasons for this, I wonder sometimes if there's some mystification around trading, because there's all this rhetoric around automatic reductions. And so I wonder if people don't understand well enough that actually what you get depends on the cap. And it's not a continuous incentive, by the way. It goes until the deadline for the program and until the cap is achieved, and then there's no incentive to further reduce. You just stay where you are. So that's a big problem. Does that answer your question, at least partially?
So what I will say is, so this was one of the proposals on the table about what the content of the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, under the Paris Agreement would contain, right? They contain what our emissions plan would be, what we think we're going to do. Here is our financial support, description of what our financial support will be, and here's what a description of our technological R&D and diffusion element would be. And some developing countries put that in as part of what they said, what their contribution and what they need might be. But it was very, very clear that developed countries did not want it in there, because the very idea that these would be expressed as commitments at the same level as the emissions reductions might be commitments was anathema in the concept of the negotiations. And the reason why I think it's anathema is that the Paris Agreement represents a fundamental break with the historical discussion around common and differentiated responsibilities, because that was the only way they could get the U.S. and other countries to agree, which was that we will no longer make that distinction between developed and developing countries when it comes to commitments to emissions. And the primary reason, I think, and this is, I think, goes to your point about the discourse, right, which is, how do you get people to participate and discuss? Well, I think we lost the debate in part because the technology debate has fundamentally become a debate, both in the UNFCCC, but also in developed countries, solely about China. It's become solely about China. Every time we begin to even have a discussion about international technology transfer or support, China comes up. And China comes up as the model of, well, we're not going to give technology to China. We're not going to give financial support to China. And the reason I think that is the case is because I think it's a proper diagnosis. The climate issue is fundamentally an industrial policy problem, right? It's less an environmental problem in many ways, and more that it's an industrial policy problem. And if it's defined as an industrial policy problem, that triggers everybody's mercantilist responses here. And so I think that's part of why that explains at least a lot of the structure of the discussion and why you can't get beyond certain elements there.
The other thing is, I wonder sometimes if the co-benefits of climate policy are more evident in sectoral policies. So, renewable portfolio standards have been pretty robust in the US, and one of the reasons is they're not just climate policy. They're viewed as local air pollution policy and economic development policy and other things. And while that shouldn't be the case, because a trading or tax can also incentivize local air pollution reductions and have some of the same co-benefits, I think the fact that you're being technologically specific makes it more salient to the public what these co-benefits are. And if you look around the world at really ambitious policies, they're almost not climate policies. The feed-in tariff started out as an agricultural support policy, the French nuclear program, which is about the only near zero utility sector in the developed world, other than places with abundant hydropower, is a national pride, energy independence policy. You go around the world and like the really effective stuff is not just climate policy.
Carbon markets rather than taxes has to do with grandfathering of existing sources. It's just pure politics of continuing to be able to run these facilities, starting with sulfur dioxide, et cetera. And if you go to a taxing regime, then you shift the costs internationally in some ways, which make it really difficult. I think you're pointing out the competitiveness issues is really helpful, but what you could avoid that by having international impose a tax directly on everyone, but then you get exactly the problem Jay rose. Who's going to fund it and which way does the money flow? So I'm wondering, how do we change the politics of that issue? Because we're not going to change the World Trade Organization rules to make the border tax adjustment issue go away, or border carbon issue go away, so that we can then try to get this on a more sectoral basis.
Wow. Changing global politics in 2 years. 2 to 7. That's, what can I say? I don't think any of us has an answer to that question. Requires commitment at the international relations level that I just don't see where that's going to come from.
You're asking about the competitiveness dynamic and how we change that?
I think, thinking back to the buckshot approach, right? Part of the solutions, I think, is selling it. There are short-term solutions and long-term solutions, and I think some of these short-term solutions that are individualized, things like Ed was talking about, that are people can take steps, that people can buy into this, make it easier on the individual level. On the long term, how do we sell a public investment in what we need to address climate change across the globe? I think a lot of it has to do with our technology is going to have to catch up, right? We're going to have. We see the investments, you have investments in all these small scale projects. I think a lot of that's looking towards, at least from research I've heard from other people, is looking for nuclear fusion or other things that are long-term solutions, but we need to have the time to get there. And we just don't have that right now. And so these smaller investments, making sure we have where there can be investments in wind technology and hydro technology and efficiency rates, and then at the national level, at the global level, Eric was talking about this, that if countries make these investments in one technology that becomes cost efficient, whether it be solar from China or others, that's going to be pushing it forward. And the buy-in is going to be at these small level to get us to what's possible long term. And I don't think, at least in our country, the nuclear power plants are all being shut down in terms of the old style, aren't competitive financially because of fracking, and fusion. Our investment in fusion, I know that just recently MIT shut down. Their physics department had a nuclear fusion program that's now been shut down. There's only 5 universities in the US that have nuclear fusion programs. And I think that a lot of the things we're looking at now is, what are we going to do the next 100 years? We need the next generation, the generation of the college students, those that are in the 5-year-olds to 25-year-olds, buying into what our long-term solutions are. And so, I think a lot of it is going to be these nuclear fusion, these broader programs that will be are not technically or financially feasible now, but we have to aim towards that and figure out the small-term solutions that can get us to that point.
And I guess I think that the international system has moved pretty well. It's not nearly fast or stringent enough for this problem, but Paris is a pretty remarkable achievement, and when you look what's going on, China is actually ahead of its projections. It has a 5-year plan that's more ambitious than what it pledged. In Paris, the big problem is us. And I don't think it's a climate problem, especially. I think thinking of the US problem as a climate problem is a mistake. I think the US problem is an anti-government problem. That is, one political party has made opposition to the government its primary modus operandi, and now we have a radical authoritarian who really wants to tear down the government in office. And I think, it's really about, at this point, about preserving democracy. And I also think that some of the anxiety that plays out in opposition to trade and opposition to environmental policy, has to be countered with a more realistic approach to generating higher wages, which are lacking. And there is no serious effort by any political party to address low wages, in my view, except, on the minimum wage. So I just think that it's not a climate problem. Now, all that said, if we had all this lined up so the US was sane and we had Paris, there'd still be a problem that would be huge just because the needs are so great on such a short time scale, and this is just huge. On the other hand, there's some optimism because the renewable energy prices have dropped to the point where it's no longer a big cost barrier. The barrier is how do you figure out how to run an electricity grid integrating that much renewables. If you can't do that, how do you get political acceptance for nuclear? So that's...
I guess I could add just a couple of comments very briefly. The one thing that might change everybody's mind is if Miami disappeared. Could happen in 10 years, who knows? But beyond that, I did allude briefly to the fact that the corporate sector seems to be coming online, at least the international global corporate sector. And if you combine that sort of change in politics with the fact that a global tax, if there were such a thing, would generate tons of revenue, that you could start negotiating over who's going to get the revenue and how. Maybe that would make a difference.
Yeah, better have that fight, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. You had a question, and then Mikey.
Oh, thanks. So this may be totally off the wall, but thinking about what everyone was saying about how opposition to government is such a problem in the United States. There are some lawsuits in progress that are either intergenerational equity issues or something, actually suing the fossil fuel industry, sort of the way it was done with the tobacco industry. Is there any reason to hope that that will have any kind of impact the way it did in the tobacco world? Like Joel was suing about climate change.
So, fair notice, I'm a board member of an organization that is involved in those suits, Center for International Environmental Law. So, take what I say with that in mind. But one of the things to think about is that those suits have both they're trying to change the legal discourse on that, but the bigger part of that is really this broader storytelling that they're trying to do more broadly, right? Which is, this is about these children. They have a stake in the future, and they are calling the adults to account for this. And so you both get this interesting sort of factual basis that is developed through the legal mechanism, where, for whatever reason, a factual basis that's developed in the context of a legal process Americans find that relatively convincing in many ways than a scientific process. But nevertheless, right, the lawyers win on that one, I suppose. But in that process, developing both a factual basis in the context of a legal discussion, that is the basis on which I think the tobacco analogy works. But I think the stronger one is telling the story about, what is going to be happening to our future. These are the people who are the future. Is the future going to be there for them? What kind of future is it going to be? Who's going to be accountable for helping them get there, right? And so all of that, I think, has been one of the really strongest parts of that. You see this being picked up locally and in local news. The kids are showing up in local news TV and things like that. And so I think that element of it has been really particularly useful as a strategic matter.
Now, I had a question, which is I was kind of wondering, you sort of drew the climate as sort of an extension of the Montreal problem, right?
Yeah.
But things have changed a lot. That is, Montreal was a few technologies that we had a monopoly of, and they were basically unused in the developing countries. I mean, they just didn't have air conditioning and so on. And now we're at a point in the history of the world where, China is a major industrial economy. It produces much of the solar panels for much of the world. And I don't know what its capabilities are in terms of producing electric cars, but on the other hand, they're beginning to get to levels of wealth where purchasing these things is not exactly beyond their means. India is a little different, but not. I don't know. Maybe that's the part of the answer. Is India is really different, but I just wonder if international negotiations and technology transfer and sort of that governmental model we had in Montreal was quite as central to climate disruption as it was to ozone depletion in light of sort of the developments since then in the developing world.
I think your question was sort of about the narrative of it, and I think you can see the comment about, well, if Miami disappears, but I think you can see narratives changing. I mean, we'll see a year from now, 2 years from now, but a narrative can change very quickly. After Parkland, the narrative on guns in this country changed quite quickly. Part of it is figuring out how we communicate in a way that people are engaged to participate and tell their narrative, tell their story, whether, with young children, came across in Parkland, there was a very different, even the parents in Newtown couldn't convey in the same way, these are my children, this is my 5 or 6 year old, didn't have the same impact as, these are my friends, I was shot, this is my future. I think we have, with some of the more extreme weather and other things where we have potential for these catastrophic events in my daughter's lifetime, I think it becomes a narrative that people might be more engaged in, even if they can't understand some of these issues at the minute, at the close economic, environmental level. They can understand it at a, when you looked at Houston, you looked at Miami, you looked at Puerto Rico, those extreme weather events, I think, you look at California and the fires, those extreme weather events, as we have more of them, may help swing the narrative in a way if we have if technology's options, the buckshot options in place to move us forward, that there may be more support for it.
I was checking for the technology transfer. I'm not interested in the question. The answer now is has a question. Thinking about in what ways it is possible to reforming international institutions. And I'm thinking here is that there's kind of a silo, right? And then you're talking about the World Climate Fund, the technology transfer is a part of that. Keep talking about the WTO, whether the border adjustments would be illegal or WTO. Perhaps the WTO wasn't set up to deal with environmental issues. Sure. You have a trade silo, you have a climate silo, and you really need something that encompasses all of that. I don't know, I think those of you that work in institutions, how do you bridge those gaps? How do you get away from a multi-silo approach to actually having something that's covers everything?
Yeah. Future questions that both Diego and Keith talked about. So Keith, Diego, you mentioned the dynamic versus static. I think you can maybe collaborate on that. And Keith, you mentioned the agricultural analogs and the problem of local conditions. Obviously, the Green Revolution came to mind.
Sure.
It does relate to our discussion at many levels. Success, failures, maybe overall success, concern about the agricultural patterns that the Green Revolution promoted has had some implications for climate, at least some of the negative impact of climate. So I was just curious, without going too far off tangent, this may be a total different context. If you want to elaborate a little bit about those models of tech diffusion. And Keith, if you were thinking about the Green Revolution as kind of how that might have lessons of what to do with that.
Well, I was sort of. I mean, there are different stories. The Green Revolution was about publicly funded research that was explicitly developed for the purpose of diffusion. That's not what's going on now. You know, a lot of universities and public research institutes have signed various forms of pledges that they'll make these technologies available on some sort of concessional terms, as long as the licensing and the IP works out. That's all fine, and I think more can be done at the margins in those areas, but none of that is going to generate enough diffusion to deal with these problems. So I don't know that you could come up with a green revolution in environmental technology, just because there's so many different kinds of technologies and so many different problems and targets to meet. Again, I don't think sort of saying, well, compulsory licensing is going to be okay in this area really going to change much, because it's already okay in this area. You don't need a legal reform in that context. What you probably need, and I think we agree on this, is some form of very large dedicated funding that would then generate enough resources to deploy these technologies and then work out quickly as possible, but what's sort of the efficient means of deciding which technologies are the most efficient in this context. To me, either you fill the Green Climate Fund somehow, but that's not going to happen through these private pledges, I think, or you come up with a tax of some kind.
So I think, David, your diagnosis is entirely right. The silo issue has been a problem which people have identified at the international level. Right? And so there are a couple of processes in place to try to begin to do that. So the SDGs process, the Sustainable Development Goals process, is designed around this. And there's a specific technology track to that. It is probably too high level, but there is a sense in which the goal is to create a kind of coordinating best practices policy meeting place where people from expertise from the WTO and the Climate Fund and the CBD and all these other organizations could come together to sort of begin to set sort of UN-wide kind of agreed kind of policies and outcomes and goals together that you can then take back out to each of the institutions to do that. And a lot of energy has gone into the SDGs process. The UN and the GA have spent a lot of resources on it. So I think that is one, I have friends who are in that, who are doing amazing work and who get no sleep, and who I think are optimistic about getting some high-level statement, high-level goals, and a regular sort of annual coordination process for that. I think that would go. I think the more concrete policy coordination part, the very specific sort of, okay, we need to do this in the climate change negotiations. Could you people over at the WTO make some room for us to be able to do that? That process is much harder in place because each of the institutions is so jealous of its jurisdiction, both as a legal matter, but also as a political matter. And that's not so much the institutions as the domestic players. So for the WTO, the trade ministries are really, really sure they don't want to hang out with the environment ministries. And there's a mechanism that I think is a problem. You have the same sort of Commerce versus State Department problem here in the US, right? As you must have experienced, Keith, being over it, right? And so getting those two to
What's the WTO?
Yeah, right? Getting USTR to talk to the State Department about like common sort of coordination issues is a real problem around that.
This may be naive, I'm sure it is. The WTO is a moribund institution. It's not going anywhere. It has no prospect of going anywhere unless and until new issues come along that reinvigorate it. This may be one.
Yeah, and they know this. They know there's a legitimacy problem for them, and this is one of the areas that they are. I mean, the director there is very clear. This is the thing he wants them to begin to get involved in, but not on the IP side, just on the trade side, not the IP side, because that's weird and nobody wants to have to deal with that. And so I think, there is movement to try to do that, but I can point to one ray of hope, right, about narrative changing, which is joint R&D, right? One of the ways to really think through sort of, okay, what are the avenues for doing this kind of cooperation results-oriented work is sort of really encouraging joint R&D, and you begin to see this around mission innovation and work around with China and the U.S. around in the energy department. Oh yeah, around the energy department, there's some great collaborative R&D beginning to work to move along there. The more that we begin to see, I think, the better we can tell the story about an optimistic outcome, about a joint working together, going towards the future-oriented outcome to the climate problem. And joint R&D is one of the ways to begin to tell that story, I think, in ways that very few other parts of the framework can.
That's what we're in. Thank you so much. Give a round of thanks for all of our visitors from out of state. So thank you for taking the time to share your ideas about visitors. Lunch will be served on the 4th floor, 436 for the speakers. The elevators are just outside. I have a little caravan going up there. Probably wait at the elevators. 430. I always get lost at every floor. But I think I can figure out where 436 is. I think I taught there once. So, look forward to that. I do want to give out a thanks to Lisa Cummings, the faculty assistant, for making all the arrangements.
Yes, she did. It's such a pleasure.
And so thank you again.